Hello, my dears. Today we are back with another macabre story about Tinder dating. Are you ready to feel the chills running down your spine? Grab your headphones and say your prayers, because we are about to embark on another scary story. Derek Wallace, a 29-year-old man from Seattle, meets a charming yet enigmatic woman named Violet through a dating app. Lured by her intrigue and the promise of seeing her family's special room in a secluded Oregon forest, Derek embarks on a journey that transforms into a descent into terror. The Red Room turns out to be more than a place. It's a trap tied to ancient forces beyond comprehension. Derek's tale serves as a chilling warning about curiosity and trusting the wrong people. Not all doors are meant to be opened. That's a lesson Derek Wallace learned too late. He wasn't the first, and I doubt he'll be the last. But his story, it lingers in my mind like a bad taste, sticking to the corners of my memory no matter how hard I try to shake it loose. You see, I've spent my life dealing with the unseen, forces that most folks dismiss as nonsense until they're staring them right in the face. I'm not talking about campfire tales or cheap scares, no. I'm talking about the kind of darkness that crawls into your bones and makes you question everything you thought you knew. Derek's story begins, like so many others, with a man looking for something to fill the emptiness in his life. He wasn't a bad guy, not by a long shot, just lost like so many people these days. At 29, he worked long hours at a truck repair shop in Seattle, fixing rigs for a living. His hands were always dirty with grease, his jeans worn from the labor, and his evenings were spent alone, watching old reruns and eating microwave dinners. Loneliness has a way of sneaking up on a man, and for Derek, it had crept in so quietly that he didn't notice it until it was too late. So when he met Violet through a dating app, it must have felt like a breath of fresh air. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. Her messages were full of charm, her voice over the phone soft and playful. She had a way of making him feel seen, like she'd pulled him out of the fog he'd been wandering through. They talked for weeks, and each conversation seemed to draw him in deeper. Violet spoke about her family's old house in the Oregon woods, painting pictures of its rustic beauty. But there was always one thing she came back to, a room she called the Red Room. "It's my favorite place in the house," she told him one evening. "It's where my family keeps its history. You'd love it." Derek laughed, brushing it off. "What kind of history?" "You'll see," she replied, her tone teasing. "Why don't you come visit? You can see for yourself." Now, Derek wasn't the type to take risks, but there was something about Violet that made him forget himself. Maybe it was her smile. Maybe it was the way she spoke, like she was sharing a secret only he was worthy of hearing. Whatever it was, it worked. By the end of the call, he'd agreed to drive down the following weekend. "I can't wait to show you," Violet said, her voice warm but holding a hint of something else, something he couldn't quite place. The drive down to Oregon started off easy enough. The highways were familiar, lined with the same fast food joints and gas stations he'd seen 1,000 times before. But as he got closer to the address Violet had given him, the scenery began to change. The trees grew taller, their branches stretching out like arms trying to block the light. The road narrowed, turning from smooth asphalt to cracked pavement to gravel. Derek noticed the signal bars on his phone dropping until, finally, the screen went blank. He should have turned around then. Lord knows he should have. But curiosity has a way of quieting that voice inside you that says something's not right. And Derek, well, he'd already come this far. When he finally pulled up to the house, he was struck by how out of place it felt. It was big, 2 stories tall, with a wide porch wrapped around the front. But it wasn't grand. The wood was weathered, the paint peeling, and the windows were narrow, almost squinting at him. The house sat on a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest. It looked like it had been waiting for him. Violet was standing on the porch when he arrived, smiling like she'd been watching for his truck to appear through the trees. Her hair was dark and sleek, falling over her shoulders like a river of ink. She wore a loose dress that fluttered in the breeze, and as Derek climbed out of the truck, she waved him over. "You made it," she said, stepping down to meet him. "Yeah," he replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "This place is something else. It's even better inside," Violet said, taking his hand. Her touch was warm, but Derek couldn't help noticing the chill in the air. "Come on, I'll show you." The moment he stepped inside, Derek felt it. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of something sweet and metallic, like old flowers left to wilt. Violet didn't seem to notice. She led him through the rooms, pointing out family heirlooms and telling stories about her ancestors. There were photographs on the walls, old black and white portraits of stern-looking men and women with eyes that seemed to follow him as he moved. The furniture was antique, the kind of stuff you'd see in a museum: clawfoot tables, high-backed chairs, a grandfather clock that ticked just a little too loudly. But what stuck with Derek were the carvings. They were subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. Strange symbols etched into the wood of the doorframes, the edges of the furniture, even the beams overhead. He didn't recognize them, but they made the hairs on his arms stand up. "You've got an interesting place," he said, trying to keep his voice light. Violet glanced at him, her smile faint. "Wait until you see the red room." They reached the end of a long, narrow hallway, and there it was, the door she'd been talking about. It was deep red, the color so rich it seemed to pulse in the dim light. It didn't match the rest of the house, standing out like a wound on pale skin. "This is it," Violet said, her voice almost a whisper. She rested her hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn it. Derek felt a sudden tightness in his chest, a pressure he couldn't explain. "What's in there?" he asked. "You'll see," she said with a sly smile. "But not yet. It's better at night." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. They had dinner in the old dining room, the table set with candles that flickered and danced, casting shadows on the walls. Violet poured him wine that tasted stronger than it should have, and though she smiled and laughed, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Not Violet, but something else, something bigger. And when Violet finally looked at him across the table and said, "It's time," Derek felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He'd come all this way. He'd let curiosity lead him to the edge of something he couldn't explain, and now there was no turning back. When Violet said, "It's time," Derek didn't know if it was excitement or dread that surged through him. Maybe it was both. The house had already unsettled him. Its quiet, its weight, the way shadows lingered in corners just a moment too long. But there was something about Violet's smile, a mixture of reassurance and something else, something darker. She took his hand and led him back to the hallway. The red door loomed at the end like a bloodstain on the walls, its crimson surface catching the light of the candles she carried. The walk felt longer this time. The air seemed heavier, thicker, and Derek's footsteps sounded muffled against the floorboards. When they reached the door, Violet turned to him, her eyes gleaming in the flickering light. "Are you ready?" she asked. Derek hesitated. Every fiber of his being screamed to turn around, to leave, but he nodded anyway. "Yeah, I'm ready." She smiled, pulling the dark metal key from her pocket. It gleamed dully, cold and ancient-looking. She inserted it into the lock and turned it slowly, the sound of the mechanism clicking open sending a shiver down Derek's spine. The door swung open with a soft creak, and a faint glow spilled into the hallway. The room was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The walls were draped in red velvet fabric, rich and textured, but uneven, as if it had been stitched together by hand. The ceiling arched higher than it should have, giving the space an unnatural depth. In the center of the room stood a round table, and on it were three objects: a tarnished bronze mirror, a cluster of red candles burning low, and a leather-bound book that looked older than time itself. "What is this place?" Derek asked, stepping inside. His voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the heavy air. "It's my family's heart," Violet said softly. She followed him in, closing the door behind her. The sound of the lock clicking into place made Derek's stomach twist. "Everything that matters to us is here." He moved toward the table, drawn to the objects as if they were calling to him. The mirror caught his eye first. Its surface wasn't smooth like glass. It seemed almost liquid, rippling faintly, even though nothing touched it. "What's with the mirror?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It shows the truth," Violet replied, standing just behind him. Her voice was calm, almost soothing. "Look into it." Derek hesitated. Something about the way she said it felt wrong, but he couldn't stop himself. He leaned in and stared into the mirror's surface. At first, he saw himself, his face pale, his eyes wide with unease. But then, the reflection changed. His features twisted, his skin paling to a sickly gray, his eyes turning black as coal. The thing staring back at him wasn't him anymore. It was something else, something wrong. He stumbled back, his heart racing. What the hell was that? "The truth," Violet said, her voice still calm. "It's who you are, or who you're meant to be." "What the hell are you talking about?" Derek snapped, the fear in his chest blooming into panic. Violet didn't answer. Instead, she picked up the book from the table and opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols and writings in a language Derek didn't recognize. He thought he saw illustrations, twisted shapes, shadows that seemed to move as his eyes scanned the page. "It's all here," she said, flipping through the pages slowly. "Everything my family has done, everything they've passed on. And now, Derek, you're a part of it." He backed away, his breath quickening. "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't sign up for this." "You didn't have to," Violet said, looking up at him. Her eyes had changed. They were darker now, almost black, reflecting the candlelight in an unnatural way. "You were chosen." "Chosen for what?" Derek's voice rose, the panic now fully gripping him. Before she could answer, the candles flickered, their flames growing taller and wilder. The shadows in the room began to move, stretching and twisting along the walls like living things. Derek froze, watching as the shadows pooled in the corners and then spilled out, creeping toward him like liquid smoke. "Violet, what's happening?" he shouted. "They're here," she said simply, her voice carrying an eerie calm. "They've come for you." The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Derek's legs and arms like tendrils. He tried to move, to fight, but the more he struggled, the tighter they held. The cold seeped into his skin, a bone-deep chill that sapped his strength. "Violet, stop this!" he yelled, desperation breaking through his voice. "Let me go!" She didn't move to help him. She stood by the table, watching with that same unsettling calm. "It's not up to me," she said. "You stepped into the Red Room. You accepted the invitation. Now you belong to them." Derek's mind raced as he fought against the shadows. He reached for the table, knocking over the candles. The flames guttered and died, plunging the room into near darkness. But the shadows didn't falter. If anything, they grew stronger, pulling him closer to the center of the room. His hand found the mirror, and without thinking, he grabbed it and hurled it at the wall. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and for a moment, the shadows recoiled. Derek used the opportunity to break free, stumbling toward the door. He yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the shadows began to stir again, rising like a wave ready to crash down. Derek pounded on the door, screaming for help. But the house was silent. The only sound was the whispers, the low, hissing voices of the shadows. "Derek," they called, the sound wrapping around him like a vice. "You can't leave." He turned to face them, his back pressed against the door. The shadows loomed taller, more defined now. They had shapes, twisted humanoid figures with eyes that burned like embers. One of them reached out, its long fingers curling toward him. In a final, desperate act, Derek lunged for the book on the table. He didn't know why, but he felt like it held some kind of answer. He flipped it open and shouted, "What do you want from me?" The shadows paused, as if considering his question. Then the whispers grew louder, and the figures surged forward. Derek screamed as they enveloped him, pulling him into the darkness. Derek's screams echoed in the suffocating darkness as the shadows closed around him, cold tendrils wrapping tighter with each passing second. He felt as if the very life was being drained from his body, leaving him hollow and weightless, as though he were dissolving into the room itself. The book in his hands fell to the floor, its pages fluttering like dying wings. "Stop!" he cried, his voice cracking. "Please stop!" But the shadows didn't listen. Their whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were deafening, a chorus of voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Derek's knees buckled and he collapsed to the ground, the velvet walls seeming to pulse with a life of their own. From the corner of his eye, he saw Violet. She stood by the table, her figure illuminated by the faint, unnatural glow of the shattered mirror's shards. Her face was serene, almost angelic, but her eyes were black pits, endless and empty. "Violet, help me," Derek begged, his voice raw and desperate. "I can't," she replied softly, her tone devoid of sympathy. "It's already begun." "What's begun?" Derek gasped, his body trembling under the weight of the shadows. She tilted her head slightly as if amused by his question. "The Red Room doesn't just hold our family's history," she explained. "It is our history. And now, Derek, it's yours too." He felt the shadows press harder against him, their cold touch seeping deeper into his skin. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he saw something in the darkness. A face, twisted and grotesque, grinning at him with sharp, gleaming teeth. "No!" Derek shouted, clawing at the floor, trying to pull himself away. "I don't belong here." "I don't belong to this." The shadows recoiled slightly, as if mocking his defiance, then surged forward again, stronger this time. They dragged him toward the center of the room, toward the table where the broken mirror lay scattered. His reflection still moved in the shards, twisted and distorted, staring back at him with a sinister smile. "Look," the whispers demanded, the voices blending into a single, commanding tone. "See yourself." "See what you are." Derek tried to turn away, but his body wouldn't obey. His head was forced downward, his eyes locking onto the largest shard of the mirror. What he saw made his heart seize in terror. The thing in the reflection wasn't just twisted, it was wrong. Its skin was gray and cracked like old stone, its eyes black voids that seemed to pull Derek's gaze deeper and deeper. And then it smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's not me. That's not me!" The whispers grew louder, almost laughing now. "It is you," they hissed. "You were chosen. You are ours." Suddenly the room shifted. The walls rippled like water, and the velvet fabric began to peel away, revealing something underneath. Something alive. Derek watched in horror as the red layers pulled back, exposing dark, pulsating flesh. The room wasn't just alive, it was a creature, and Derek was trapped inside it. He screamed again, thrashing against the shadows, but they held firm. Violet stepped closer now, her bare feet silent against the trembling floor. "You can't fight it, Derek," she said, her voice calm but cold. "No one ever does." "Why me?" Derek sobbed, tears streaming down his face. Why are you doing this to me?" "Because you came," she replied simply. "You opened the door, and now the room has claimed you." The shadows lifted him off the ground, suspending him in mid-air. Derek's limbs flailed uselessly as he was dragged toward the far wall, where the flesh seemed to part, creating an opening, a dark, gaping maw that pulsed like a heartbeat. "No! Let me go!" Derek shouted, his voice hoarse. "Please, don't do this!" But Violet only watched, her expression unreadable. The shadows pushed him closer to the opening, and Derek felt a pull, as if the darkness itself was reaching out to devour him. He tried one last time to break free, grabbing a shard of the mirror that lay nearby. With all his strength, he drove the shard into the shadows, holding his arm. The black tendrils recoiled, hissing like snakes. For a brief moment, Derek felt their grip loosen, and he fell to the ground. Gasping for air, he scrambled toward the door, his hands clawing at the red wood. "Please," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Let me out." But the door didn't budge. The whispers surrounded him again, angrier now, their voices a storm that threatened to crush him. "Derek," they hissed, "you cannot escape." The shadows surged forward, slamming into him like a wave. He was thrown backward, landing in front of the table. The book, still open, lay at his feet. Desperation overtook him as he grabbed it, flipping through the pages wildly. "What do you want from me?" he screamed at the room. The whispers fell silent for a moment, the shadows pausing. Then the room spoke, not with words, but with a presence, a force that filled every corner. Derek felt it in his bones, in his mind, in his very soul. "We want you," it said, the voice resonating deep within him. "You are ours now." The shadows struck again, wrapping around his body with unrelenting force. This time, there was no escape. Derek felt himself being pulled upward, toward the opening in the wall. The whispers grew louder, a chaotic symphony of voices that seemed to sing his doom. As the darkness swallowed him whole, Derek's last thought was of Violet. She stood by the table, her face serene, her black eyes watching as he disappeared into the room's depths. And then there was nothing but silence. The silence after Derek vanished was profound, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The red room returned to stillness, the shadows retreating into the corners, their whispers fading to faint echoes. The air grew calm, heavy, but calm. Violet stood by the table, her expression unreadable, her black eyes glimmering faintly in the dim light. For a long moment, there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the oppressive presence of the room itself. Then, the book on the table snapped shut with a loud thud, the sound reverberating through the space. Violet reached out, her pale fingers brushing against its worn cover as though sealing it closed. "Another chapter written," she murmured to herself, her voice carrying an eerie calm. She turned to the shattered mirror, its shards reflecting faint, distorted images of the room. In one fragment, Derek's face flickered briefly, his eyes wide with terror. Violet tilted her head, watching the reflection with a faint smile. "You're part of it now," she said softly. "You always were." 2 weeks later, Derek's truck was found abandoned on a narrow gravel road deep in the Oregon woods. The keys were still in the ignition, the doors locked, and the gas tank full. There was no sign of Derek himself. Local authorities searched the area but came up with nothing. No footprints, no disturbances, not even a hint of where he might have gone. The investigation was closed as a missing persons case, another unsolved mystery in a long list of strange disappearances tied to the region. But the locals, they knew better. They whispered stories about a house in the woods, a house that didn't stay in one place. Some claimed to have seen it, a two-story structure with peeling paint and narrow windows, its red door gleaming like fresh blood. No one dared go near it. Those who did, well, they never came back. As for Derek, His fate wasn't as simple as being lost. No, he was somewhere far worse. The Red Room had him now, and it didn't let go of its chosen easily. Inside the room, time didn't work the way it did outside. Hours stretched into days, days into years, or maybe it was the other way around. Derek wasn't sure anymore. All he knew was the darkness, the shadows that moved and whispered around him constantly, their voices drilling into his mind. "You belong to us," they hissed over and over again. "You opened the door." Derek couldn't escape, not physically, not mentally. The room was alive, pulsing and shifting like a living creature, and it had wrapped itself around him completely. Sometimes he thought he could hear Violet's voice, faint and distant, as if she was speaking from another world. "Don't fight it," she'd say. "The more you resist, the worse it will be." But Derek couldn't stop fighting. Even as the shadows pressed into him, even as the whispers grew louder, he clawed and screamed, searching for a way out. He didn't know how long he'd been trapped when the shadows finally stopped moving. "Derek," the voices said, blending into one deep, commanding tone. "You have seen, and now you will become." He didn't know what they meant, but he felt it, the change. It started deep inside him, a coldness spreading through his veins, his thoughts unraveling, memories slipping away like sand through his fingers. The Red Room wasn't just a prison, it was remaking him. He felt his reflection, the one he'd seen in the mirror, taking root inside him, pushing out the man he used to be. "No!" he screamed, his voice raw, his body shaking. "I'm still me. I'm still Derek." But the room only laughed, its whispers turning into a low, guttural rumble that seemed to shake the very air. The shadows enveloped him one final time, and Derek Wallace, the man he was, ceased to exist. The house disappeared from the woods that night. Some say it moved to another state, another forest, waiting for its next visitor. Others claim it only shows itself to those it chooses, those it marks long before they ever step through its door. Back in Seattle, Derek's disappearance became a fleeting headline, one more unsolved case among many. His friends and family mourned him, but as time passed, his memory faded. Life moved on. But the house never forgets. To this day, people report seeing it. Sometimes it appears on quiet suburban streets, other times deep in the countryside, hidden among overgrown trees. Always the same, 2 stories, narrow windows, and a red door that seems to glow in the moonlight. Those brave or foolish enough to approach say they hear whispers from inside. And if you look closely at the door, some say you'll see faces pressed against the glass, their eyes black and hollow, their mouths moving silently. One of those faces might just be Derek's. So if you ever find yourself walking alone at night and you see a house with a red door, do yourself a favor. Keep walking. Don't look back, because once you step inside, the Red Room doesn't just take you, it keeps you.